All right. Thank you so much, everybody. And thank you, Camilla. Really glad to have all of you here. My name is Alan. I'm one of the two co-chairs of A Better Cambridge. A Better Cambridge is an all-volunteer group. We were founded in 2013. We're focused on raising awareness and lobbying for positive action on Cambridge's housing crisis. We believe that in order to make Cambridge more affordable, sustainable, and vibrant, we need to build more housing, increase affordable housing opportunities, and strengthen tenant protections. We are one of the leading advocates for the 100% affordable housing zoning overlay that passed last year to make it easier to build affordable housing. And we're really excited to work on this petition, which we think will make it easier to build housing more generally. Daniel?
Hi, I'm Daniel Mascoop. I'm a member of Sunrise Boston. Sunrise is a movement of young people uniting to stop the climate crisis and create millions of good paying jobs in the process. We unite to make climate change an urgent priority across America and the corrupting influence of fossil fuel executives on our politics and elect leaders who stand up for the health and well-being of all people. Sunrise Boston is the Boston hub of this movement, and we have members who live all across the Boston area. This effort in supporting this petition is being led by people like me who are Sunrise members who are residents of Cambridge. And we've been involved in Cambridge issues in the past with, in particular, city council elections. And this is our first foray into housing policy.
Okay, thank you guys. Patty, Nolan, would you like to say a few words? You may need to unmute.
Okay, sorry. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
I realized my regular computer is not as good as my microphone. So I am excited to hear about this, excited to work together on at least an overarching proposal to look at zoning citywide. As hopefully most of you know, there was actually a proposal, a policy order that Councilors McGovern and Sobrino Wheeler and Simmons and I submitted to address the issue that has been talked about for a long time, which is the exclusionary zoning across Cambridge, as in many other parts of the country, that has certain parts of the city reserved only for single or two-family zoning. That was an order that unanimously passed to hold a joint housing committee and neighborhood and long-term planning committee. That meeting is now scheduled for just 2 weeks from now, February 17th. We are going to have that joint meeting. I hope all of you join that, because I think the genesis of that is exactly the genesis of many of the goals of this proposal, which is to really look at zoning in a thoughtful, comprehensive way, not in a piecemeal way across the city. Single and two-family zoning, I realize that it was in the order. It doesn't mean that we're not open to thinking about other forms of zoning as well, to think about how to make our city more welcoming and open to creating more houses where right now there's a limit on what's there. As all of you probably know, that all came about. It's been talked about, I think, in the city for many years. There was the Donovan petition, which did some of that. There's people like me who talked about it on that campaign trail. Minneapolis really, I think, jump-started the conversation when they were the first city in the country to say we are just going to eliminate single-family zoning nationwide. Or citywide, and that really meant so many other cities followed up on it. There's Portland has done some things, Austin, Texas has done some things. Nobody's done it in exactly the same way, and I would expect whatever Cambridge does will be specific to Cambridge zoning and our particular way that we always think we're unique, although we're not always so unique. I am excited that we have an opportunity to rewrite the laws that we have. I do hope this is a start of a conversation. I don't have a particular take right now on this specific proposal because it's very specific zoning ordinance language. I believe it's important before we even do that to step back and have a conversation about what are the goals that we all share, what is it that we want to address, and then have the zoning ordinance language come out of that discussion, because I'm sure, I hope most of you join me in thinking the last thing we want to do is create another divisive conversation in the community that ripped our community apart with the affordable housing overlay, which was just wherever you stood on it. I think everybody agreed it was a very challenging situation, and it created divisions when we agreed probably on 80%. We agreed on the goals, and we unfortunately, I think, spent a lot of time fighting on it instead of really moving forward. So my goal with this is to listen and learn and understand the pros and cons of this specific language. And then as I move forward, I want us to all think about what we can do citywide, always bearing in mind, if we do any upzoning, we have to think about who benefits from that and therefore really understand the consequences of what that means for the city, keeping in mind the number one goal of the city is affordable housing, and also that we cannot forget that climate resiliency is to be built into any kind of zoning change that we do. So I think that's just gives you the framework for that. Was why I had put forth, again, with 3 other counselors, this idea that let's have the council be involved in the conversation and have the conversation, since it's ultimately our role and responsibility to change any zoning, and let's really do it citywide instead of these piecemeal things, which we have often done. So I'm grateful that you all are listening to people like me, but also putting this out in the community so that we can have this conversation. I hope there's a lot more that happens in the next few months. I think that's about it. Okay, you just wanted a couple minutes, so I'm just giving you the genesis for what we worked on, and I hope we continue working. Again, I hope all of you come to that committee meeting, as many of you can. And if you can't come, then give us your thoughts on it so that we really incorporate as many voices as possible in that discussion.
Great. Thank you, Patty. I'm really excited about it. I just discovered that that meeting is going to be on my birthday, so that's a pretty cool gift. Thank you. Next, Councillor Mark McGovern, would you like to say a couple words?
Yeah, thank you. And the 17th is my son's birthday as well, so there you go. So I want to thank ABC and Sunrise for putting this forward, and also for hosting this tonight. You know, I think I'm in agreement with a lot of what Patty has said around taking a look at Cambridge's zoning, and really, you know, we're talking a lot in this city about equity and the institutional racism that exists in really in every community and in every system. And, you know, Cambridge, when zoning was, and I want to give a shout out to Will MacArthur, who's on this call, who, when I was mayor, we hired to bring in to do a report on the history of zoning in Cambridge. And, you know, what we learned is that when in the early 1900s, Cambridge actually played a really important and powerful role in getting first the state enabling legislation that allowed communities to institute their own zoning, and then obviously Cambridge then moved forward and did zoning for our city. And, you know, zoning there's a lot of good things and necessary things around zoning. You certainly don't want people living next to, you know, back then, sort of meat packing plants and slaughterhouses and things like that. But zoning also became, you know, perverse in it became a legal way in determining who gets to live where and who can afford to live where. And Cambridge is part of that history. And there were, you know, our zoning from the beginning really, you know, determined, really created gated neighborhoods in our city through zoning. And if you look at the even the 1940 census, and Will pointed this out in his report, in Res A, so, you know, the residential areas of Cambridge, 0.46%, I think I got that right, of the residents were Black. In 2017, that number climbed to a whopping 2.4 something percent. So this is not something that has just happened in 1920 or 1930 or 1940. This is something that exists today in our city, where certain neighborhoods are, you know, are off limits to certain folks. And that's why we really need to look at this. I don't, you know, nobody on this call and nobody who's around today was around then. And it's not necessarily, you know, it's not any of our fault that zoning, you know, was put into place, but it is our responsibility now, because we are here now, to look at how can we dismantle that. And if we're serious about, you know, diversity in our city and welcoming diversity and wanting to protect diversity, then that's going to mean making zoning changes to make building housing that a more diverse population can access across the city. And so I'm excited to talk about this. You know, I think it'll go a far way in sort of, you know, opening up opportunities. And so again, I just want to thank you putting this forward, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Mark. I'll hand it over to Daniel and Alan now.
Daniel, I think you're starting off, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
On the next slide. So the basis of this whole issue is that current zoning creates wasteful and expensive housing. What we see here is a housing type that we're all very familiar with and is quite common across Cambridge. And in fact, it doesn't conform to zoning. It wouldn't be allowed to be built at this point. What would be allowed to be built is this box in the second picture. And also, I think increasingly so, this is a housing type that we see in Cambridge. I live in Cambridgeport, and I can think of at least 4 or 5 developments right now in the immediate 5-block radius around where I live that look just like that. It's a single family home that takes up much less percentage of the lot, has parking and plenty of parking, and doesn't actually match what's around. It doesn't match the triple deckers. It doesn't match the townhouses. It doesn't match the other apartments nearby. And that's because new multifamily housing is prohibited by zoning. They can't legally build that without getting variance and other things. And new housing is required to have parking. When you require parking, much more of the, or when you require parking, land needs to be used for parking, which means that it can't be used for housing. And it also is used for a activity that not everybody needs or wants. And that creates the situation where we build single family homes, and single family homes are the most expensive type of housing we could build. There's a lot of unaffordable housing, but single family homes are the most unaffordable and the most expensive of all types. And that's what we have zoning wise, that's what we can build.
Yeah, so just to elaborate on that, I want to show some pictures of what we saw built before 1920. So the Cambridge zoning code was introduced in the 1920s, and most of Cambridge, if you look at when buildings was built before 1920. So if you think about what buildings you see when you walk around Cambridge, you're mostly seeing these kinds of buildings that we see on the left. These triple deckers, your 4-plexes, your 6-plexes, your 2-family houses that kind of fill up most of the lot, your townhouses. And then if you look at what we're building on the right, you're seeing these things with large concrete yards. You're seeing these fields of concrete for parking spaces, and you're seeing not very much in the way of actual housing. And the reason is that that's what we zone for. When it comes to zoning, you get what you ask for. And this is what we ask for. We ask for fields of concrete, and we ask for small houses. And I, just to call out some of these examples, some of these new buildings are in West Cambridge, where you have these bans on apartments, where you have explicit bans on multifamily housing, where you're only allowed to build single family or 2-family homes. But a lot of them aren't. A lot of them are the way they are because of other restrictions. There's a minimum lot size per dwelling unit restrictions. There's restrictions on the floor area ratio, which is a measure of how big the building can take up. And there's the parking requirements, and these combine to make it infeasible to build multifamily housing, even where it is technically legal to build multifamily housing. This example on the bottom left of the post-2000 area, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but that's on Prospect Street. That was an auto shop called Honda House, and it's been torn down, and it went on the market this weekend. There were some open houses. Each half of the 2-family house went for $1.8 million. And if you think about what that could have been, if it could have been, instead of a 2-family house, if it could have been, instead of 2 units on this very large lot, it could have been, a 6-plex, a 9-plex. It could have been units that go for a lot less. And if we didn't have parking requirements, you probably could have had an actual yard there, maybe trees, something that would have produced a much more positive outcomes for the city in terms of our environmental and our housing goals. Yeah, so that's what I want to talk about on this slide. I wanted to give some context for the housing crisis in general, just to highlight just how poorly the housing that we're building today is doing in terms of matching Cambridge's needs. Since 1980, Cambridge has added 45,000 jobs. That's a gain of 50%. A gain of 50%. But in the new buildings that have been built since 1980, there are only 9,000 housing units, we are basically relying on the suburbs to provide the housing for Cambridge's workers. You know, there's and also of those 9,000 units, they're almost all in like either single family homes, not very much in single family homes, but mostly in these high rises, in these large apartment buildings in Kendall or Alewife, where we're kind of forcing all of our development to take place. There is almost nothing in the way of missing middle housing. And that term missing middle refers to a middle level of density in between single family homes and large apartment buildings. We are building units in Cambridge. We're building them in Kendall and Alewife. We're not building enough, but we are building them. But the neighborhoods are not doing their part because the neighborhoods don't have the possibility of building this missing middle housing. And just one more data point, 72% of households in Cambridge are only 1 or 2 people. People think of family homes as large families. There are plenty of large families in Cambridge and they need housing, but most households in Cambridge are small. And the housing that we're building in neighborhoods, these single or 2 family homes, are all very large housing, large units, over 1,000 square feet per unit. The kind of development that we're encouraging is not the kind of development that's suited to our housing stock. And what that means is you get empty nesters or young couples who don't need all that much space, who are kind of sitting on a lot of space that could be used to house more people just because we don't let them create smaller options. I could answer a billion details questions about where this data comes from. As with everything, there's asterisks hidden, but I'm just gonna move on because I think the point that Mark highlighted about legacy of exclusion is very important. You might ask the question, like, why do we have these zoning rules in neighborhoods that keep out exactly the kinds of housing that would make Cambridge more affordable? And it's often by design. From Will's report, which again, everybody should read Will's report, when zoning was introduced in the 1920s, one of prominent, I think it was a Supreme Court justice, when they were legalizing zoning, they referred to apartment buildings as a parasite. They said, no, oh my God, we have to have zoning to keep out apartment buildings from our neighborhoods. If you look at, and of course, when anything comes to protecting the character of your neighborhoods from these quote unquote parasitic malicious outsiders, it's always tied to race, it's always tied to class. If you look at this graph of where we still have bans on multifamily housing on the books, apartments are banned in West Cambridge, parts of North Cambridge, a little bit near Inman Square, and this almost exactly matches the parts of Cambridge that have below average or far below average percent residents of color. This data gets much worse when you look at explicitly Black residents as well. And I want to stress that the cause and effect goes back and forth here. We wrote these zoning rules to reflect existing patterns of segregation, and then these zoning rules reinforced those patterns of segregation right back. The redlining maps that were put into place in the 1940s, it's the same maps as these maps. The same neighborhoods that we protect from multifamily housing now are the same neighborhoods that federal redlining authorities deemed desirable, meaning white, in the 40s, at the same time as they were denying mortgages to homeowners in the Port or East Cambridge, calling those neighborhoods undesirable. Zoning is one of the ways that our legacy of racism is still baked into our laws and our housing outcomes today. Daniel, I think this one's you.
In addition to the housing crisis, current zoning undermines our environmental goals. As Alan was saying, because we're not providing housing for the people who work and spend time here, we're pushing that demand out to the suburbs. And suburban households emit significantly more CO2 than city households, as you can see in this map to the left. Urban neighborhoods in Boston and Cambridge and surrounding communities are more efficient for housing. It's based on economies of scale with multiple apartments nearby. It's based on not driving in particular. And the housing shortage and the affordability crisis create long car commutes of people living far away and having to work here. And that increases traffic and emissions and wasted time. In addition, many people rather would not drive in the first place. They want walkable neighborhoods close to their family. We all living in Cambridge enjoy those types of neighborhoods. And a lot of other people would like neighborhoods like that, but are forced and pushed out by the affordability crisis and the housing shortage to live in communities where they can't have that type of lifestyle and they have to drive. Current zoning contributes to that, especially because it has parking minimums. It requires that residential units have parking spaces. This uses a lot of space, which takes space away from residential space, apartments, and provides something that residents don't even want. 32% of households in Cambridge don't own a vehicle in the first place. And so we're requiring that they pay for that. And that doesn't make too much sense to me. Requiring off-street parking means less green space, less permeable area, and fewer trees, and more expensive housing because you can't build the units that you would like to build. Cambridge's existing dense neighborhoods are some of the greenest in the state, but as we know, zoning, the way that zoning is written, we can't build similar neighborhoods now, so it's gradually making these neighborhoods less sustainable.
So now that I hope you all agree that with all that, it is time for our residential neighborhood zoning to get a second look. Our proposal is relatively simple. It's basically Cambridge has a number of zoning districts, residence A, residence B, residence C. Different neighborhoods are zoned different levels of density, but in all of these districts, there's not enough density allowed to build the kinds of walkable neighborhoods that we like. What we want to do is want to consolidate each of these residential districts into a residence N district, meaning neighborhood. This is kind of like what Somerville did, where they just created a residential neighborhood zoning category. And in that residence N district, we want to allow 3 stories of multifamily housing. Not to cover the entire lot. We're not talking like, a huge like cover everything. We would restrict it to 40% of the lot. So that leaves 60% of the lot for yards, open space, access paths, etc. Parking, if that's something that the owner wants. But the parking wouldn't be required and the housing would be allowed to be 3 stories and take up 40%. So that's the broad idea. And like Councillor Nolan talked about, there's a lot of precedent for this kind of idea. She mentioned Minneapolis, which was kind of the one that hit the news really hard and kicked off this conversation. But as Minneapolis was debating this, our own city planning process in Cambridge was coming to a similar conclusion. In the Envision Cambridge final report, there is a recommended action that says we need to adjust our zoning in residential districts to be more compatible with prevailing patterns of development. In the intervening years, it's kind of caught on as a nationwide trend. Portland has has legalized multifamily housing by right almost everywhere, ended off-street parking minimums almost everywhere. Sacramento did the same thing just last week, actually. It was kind of we were about to launch this petition and then we saw the good news. And then Berkeley, California, actually, I think 2 days ago, Berkeley ended parking minimums as well. So this is something that around the country, people are kind of all coming to the consensus that we're facing a housing crisis. It's time for these rules to end. And I also really want to thank Councillor Nolan for spearheading the policy order and the committee hearing that she mentioned. The whole city council signed on unanimously to this statement that single-family zoning is an unnecessary, single-family only zoning, sorry, is an unnecessary artifact of historically exclusionary housing practices. So, I think we all kind of agree that we need to do something like this. The only question is the details. And so we are trying to provide a template, a pathway for getting those details right. So to talk about those details, as I mentioned, we are proposing to let 3-story buildings fill up to 40% of a lot's area. There's a lot of numbers on the slide. I apologize. I'm not going to go through each one of them, but you can go to our website on the Learn More section panel, the Cambridge MMH website. There's an Understanding the Proposal article, which goes into each of these dimensional restrictions and talks about how they make it harder to build multifamily housing and why the standards that we've set in our proposal are reasonable ones. But as the basic guiding principle is something that I alluded to earlier. What you zone for is what you ask for, and it's what you get. So we kind of look at this example of this 2.5-story house, this 99 Fairweather Street, and say, how can we make dimensional standards that will allow buildings like that to be built? I want to highlight the height limit here is 40 feet because most of the triple deckers and 2.5-story houses around Cambridge are actually, they're not 35 feet, they're between 35 and 40 feet. So we want to move the height limit to 40 feet, but we're putting in a flat 3-story cap so that nobody's incentivized to try and cram 4 stories into those 40 feet. And the FAR, that's the floor area ratio, the 1.25 number, that's the number that limits the 3-story building to only 40% of the lot. Basically, it's the ratio of the total amount of floor space of the house with all its floors added up divided by the lot area. So if you take the 3 stories of the house, divide 1.25 by that, that's where you get your 40% number. So again, I want to emphasize it. Like, you might think like, oh, this building on the top, this blue building, that takes up about 40% of the lot. No. It actually takes up like 20% of the lot. What taking up 40% of the lot means is something like what we generally have around Cambridge. It's this dark brown building. It's what most of the buildings in Cambridge conform to. So that's the details of our proposal. You can read more at our website. But Daniel, I think you were going to talk about the overall impact.
So just to bring it all together, our proposal is to make a more inclusive, greener Cambridge. That means less expensive and a greater variety of housing. This provides more options for renters and buyers and encourages developers to add housing units when developing rather than removing them. It creates less exclusive, more diverse neighborhoods. Much like we've said, over time, current zoning is creating conditions that do not match our neighborhoods. Over time, we should just decrease residential segregation and address the racist and classist legacy of our zoning policy. It also would lower emissions with more energy efficient buildings. Multifamily units are more efficient, and it also provides more permeable space on the properties. And it would allow people to live car-free rather than incentivizing them to have cars for the space that they have for cars. It also would be easier for homeowners to preserve or add units. More current properties would conform to zoning, making it easier to maintain and improve their properties. It also would encourage redevelopments that add housing rather than removing them. So when people are developing, as opposed to, again, developing to single family housing zoning, they could develop with more apartments rather than removing them. It would be easier for renters to find ways to stay in Cambridge with more options for housing, more apartments rather than single family homes. It provides more options that renters would be interested in and able to live in. It also would be easier for local businesses to attract foot traffic. With the more multifamily units, there's more people in the neighborhood to attract foot traffic for local businesses and to live a car-free lifestyle.
So as to the timing of this petition, so we introduced it last week at City Hall. It appears on the City Council's agenda for this coming Monday. I hope you will all come out and show your support for the petition. We will have talking points and a public comment guide on our website tomorrow morning. This happens every time there's a zoning amendment. The first time it shows up at City Council, the council is not deciding what to do with it. They're discussing it and forward it on to hearings for discussion. So don't expect council to be taking a vote or anything. In mid-February, on what I think she said was the 17th, there will be that joint hearing of the Housing Committee and the Neighborhood and Long-Term Planning Committee to look at the bigger picture of the kinds of reforms we want to be doing. It won't be focused on this petition, but it's a good opportunity to speak up in favor of this petition and just in favor of making sure that when we address this issue, we do it in a way that we do it right, basically. We think that the planning board and the ordinance committee will end up having hearings on this petition. The timing is flexible. We don't know when they'll be scheduling it for, but it'll probably be sometime in March. And then as April and May move on, depending on how the council feels, they might have subsequent hearings. They might send it to a vote directly. They might table it. We don't know. We certainly hope that they will pass it. But the whole story will be wrapped up one way or the other by the end of June. When you submit zoning amendments, they have a fixed clock that will expire. The council will go on summer break at the end of June. If this petition does expire, that doesn't mean it's the end of the conversation. There will be, the council could bring it back in a revised form. But I think and I hope that we will have enough opportunity to discuss this in the process that we have between now and the end of June, that the council will be able to pass something like this the first go round. So that's the process. I think that's it, and we want to open up for questions.
Thank you, Alan and Daniel. So yes, so if you can submit your questions in the chat, that would be really helpful. And if there are any questions there already, Kathleen, could you pass them on?
Yeah, we have sort of two comments that I'm going to rephrase as a question that are about asking about our existing housing and how it is grandfathered to not meet the zoning that it has because it's higher, wider, and more dense. And one person was asking about the lot 40% lot coverage number that's in the petition because they did the math on the building that they live in, which has a 76% lot coverage.
So in response to the question about why use FAR at all, the reason is because we want to keep this petition focused on the goals of what it's accomplishing. Somerville did a zoning redesign recently. They switched to a more form-based code that didn't rely on something like FAR. It took them 7 years to do it. I think it would be really cool to see Cambridge embark on a comprehensive zoning reform process that changes not just what the outcomes we get, but how zoning works. But that's not the goal of this petition. The goal of this petition is to address our equity, affordability, and sustainability concerns. And with regards to the point of most of our existing housing being grandfathered, that's a huge part of why we want to do something like this. That the housing we have, you cannot, if you want to redevelop it, you have to tear it back down and build it back up, but you have to build it back up much smaller. That's why you see these down conversions to single family homes. I think someone pulled the number that in the past 2 years, we have lost more units to renovations than we have gained them. And that's insane in a housing crisis.
All right, I see that Counselor Jeevan Sabrina Wheeler has joined us. And so while we wait for some more questions in the chat, would you like to say a few words?
Sure. I don't have a lot to add right now. I'm really glad to see so many folks on the call. This is a great thing to be talking about. I was coming from a retirement party for one of the staff members here in Cambridge, so I missed Councillor Nolan's comments and Councillor McGovern's at the beginning, but it's great to be talking about sort of moving beyond single family zoning. Sacramento got rid of it a few weeks ago, Minneapolis a few months before that. It's just allowing the kinds of triple-decker apartments that I live in, that most of the folks live in throughout the city. There are lots of different ways to do that. I think zoning is always, complicated. I'm really looking forward to talking about this proposal when it comes before the council in a few weeks. And parking minimums, I think, are the other big piece of it, of thinking about how we have apartments that most folks can afford to live in Cambridge, and how we get beyond requiring parking in a city that's dense and transit oriented like Cambridge. So looking forward to the discussion.
I'd like to add in addition to what Jeevan was saying about the parking minimum question. When we're talking about parking minimums and eliminating parking minimums, that's one part. At the same time, we're all interested in, and many of us who signed the petition, one of the clauses at the beginning said we're encouraging, and this is a potential and expected policy order for the city to undertake a comprehensive parking study and review, because we understand that the current parking schemes, whether it's residential permit parking fees or parking minimums, not just for residential, but also for commercial. And then also this concept of parking maximums that has been implemented in other cities across, I don't know how many cities, but a few cities across the country. And Somerville in certain zones did recently implement parking maximums as part of their zoning reform that Alan was talking about. And so this is all related. So in addition to what Jeevan was talking about with the parking minimums, we're looking forward to the review and investigation of how Cambridge can better manage its parking in general.
Thanks. So it looks like we've got a couple more questions. Kathleen?
Yeah, I think all of those questions are probably ones that are best probably discussed in the breakout groups, because we're getting into some really great detailed questions. And so I want to go ahead and let folks get into their breakout groups so we can have that discussion.
Yeah, I do actually, before we jump, I want to respond to one of the questions I saw about affordable subsidy housing. And I want to point out that we have an affordable housing overlay that passed very recently that gives a density bonus for 100% affordable projects. And that's the answer to why we don't want to allow 4 stories by right for market rate housing. We want to make sure that affordable developers preserve their advantage. Sorry, I know there will be more discussion of that in the breakout group, but I wanted to highlight that for the whole group.
Great point to highlight. Yep.
The only other thing to add there too is that there is something about scale here that, you know, affordable housing developers typically need a minimum scale to get public subsidy to make those affordable developments feasible. So this is filling a gap between single family and what they can finance typically.
So I think I've broken everyone into breakout rooms sort of